Hey guys, tonight we begin with the rather tangled lives of the most inbred women in medieval history, born of cousins, married to uncles, and occasionally both. These ladies were caught in the royal tradition of keeping it in the family genetically and politically, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you, as it is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. As a historian who has spent a lifetime sifting through the dusty archives of Europe's great dynasties, and as a theologian who has pondered deeply upon the nature of divine providence versus human arrogance, I often find myself returning to the tragic, cyclical history of the Habsburg and Trastamara bloodlines. For in these stories we see not merely a biological curiosity, but a profound spiritual and human tragedy, where the obsession with preserving power through blood purity resulted in a legacy of suffering that no crown could alleviate. Let us turn our gaze first to the figure of Juana of Castile, born in the year of our Lord 1479, the third child of the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. A couple whose influence upon the tapestry of history cannot be overstated, for they were the architects of a unified Spain, the financiers of Columbus's voyages to the New World, and the fierce expellers of the Moors, yet in their fervent desire to consolidate their power and ensure that their dominions remained within the family, they adhered to the perilous tradition of cousin marriage, a practice that the Trastamara dynasty had embraced with a zeal that would eventually curdle the very blood they sought to protect. By the time Juana entered this world, the royal lineage had been stirred and concentrated to a point where the vitality of the line was compromised, manifesting not just in physical ailments, but in a predisposition towards a deep, chronic melancholy and emotional instability that the courts of the time were ill-equipped to understand, much less treat with compassion. As a young woman, Juana was a pawn in the great game of European diplomacy, shipped off to the misty, unfamiliar lands of Flanders to wed Philip the Handsome, a man whose moniker perhaps overstated his physical virtues but certainly understated his ambition, for he was a Habsburg, a scion of a house that collected kingdoms as others might collect coins, and who viewed genetic warnings as mere suggestions rather than biological imperatives. He was naturally her cousin, a fact that raised no eyebrows in a world where the family tree was often a single, gnarled branch turning back upon itself. In the early days of their union there was a glimmer of hope, for Juana was intelligent, striking in her appearance, and possessed of a passionate intensity that led her to fall deeply in love with her husband. A tragic vulnerability in an age where royal marriages were transactions of state rather than unions of the heart. Philip, however, was a man of the world, less enamored with his wife and more interested in the political leverage she represented and the various other women who populated his court. A reality that tormented Juana, whose jealousy was not merely the petulance of a neglected wife, but the anguish of a soul demanding the loyalty she had been promised before God. When Philip died suddenly, an event attributed by some to typhoid and by others to the inevitable karma that stalks the unfaithful, Juana's grief shattered whatever fragile composure she had managed to maintain, leading to the behavior that would earn her the epithet La Loca, for she refused to be parted from his earthly remains, traversing the dusty plains of Spain with his coffin in tow, occasionally opening it to gaze upon the face of the man who had been both her beloved and her tormentor. To the modern mind, and indeed to the cynical political operatives of her own time, this was madness, yet as I look back through the lens of history, I see a woman broken by a world that demanded she suppress her humanity for the sake of a crown, and it is a bitter irony that her father Ferdinand and later her own son, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, used her grief as a convenient pretext to seize the reins of power, locking her away in a convent where she would spend the remainder of her long, sorrowful life. Was she truly mad, or was she simply a woman of profound feeling trapped in a cage of political expediency? Labeled insane because her emotions were inconvenient to the men who sought to rule in her name. It is a question that haunts the archives, reminding us that history is often written by the cold-hearted against the passionate. If Juana serves as a tragic prelude, then Maria Ana of Spain stands as the sorrowful crescendo of this genetic symphony, born in 1634 to Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria. Who were themselves cousins woven tightly into the Habsburg web. She was a woman of intelligence, piety, and kindness. Virtues that would be tested to their limit by the destiny her family had carved out for her. In a move that defies all biological wisdom but adheres strictly to the logic of dynastic consolidation, Maria Ana was married to her own uncle, Ferdinand III, the Holy Roman Emperor. A union that turned the family tree into a suffocating loop, yet she bore this burden with the dignity characteristic of her station, bringing a sense of grace to the imperial court, even as the genetic consequences of her lineage began to manifest with undeniable severity. Her most significant and heartbreaking contribution to history was her son, Charles II of Spain, a monarch whose very existence was a testament to the hubris of his ancestors. For he inherited not only the vast Spanish Empire, but a genetic legacy so ravaged by generations of inbreeding that his physical and mental frailty was apparent from the moment he drew breath. Charles, known to history as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, possessed the oversized Habsburg jaw to such an extreme that he could barely chew. Suffered from chronic illnesses that left him perpetually on the brink of death, and struggled with basic cognitive functions. A tragic figure who should have been the ruler of the world, but was instead a prisoner of his own biology. We must not judge Maria Ana for this, for she did not invent the system that produced her son, and indeed, the historical record shows her to be a mother of fierce devotion. Acting as regent during Charles's minority, and attempting to shield her vulnerable child from the circling vultures of the court who viewed his weakness as an opportunity for advancement. She fought to maintain the integrity of the Spanish Empire, even as it crumbled under the weight of its own stagnation and the inability of its monarch to provide an heir. A struggle that was akin to holding back the tide with sheer will. When Maria Ana passed away in 1696, followed closely by her son, it marked the end of a tragedy that had played out over centuries, culminating in the War of the Spanish Succession. A conflict sparked by the biological collapse of a dynasty that had forgotten that a king is first a man, and a man requires a healthy lineage to survive. Let us also consider Isabella of Habsburg, born in 1501, the daughter of Philip the Handsome and Juana of Castile, making her the sister of Emperor Charles V and the niece of half the crowned heads of Europe, a woman whose DNA was a royal recipe repeated until it had lost all vitality. A base of Habsburg mixed with a dash of Trastamara and absolutely no fresh genetic material to revitalize the bloodline. At the tender age of 17, she was married to Christian II of Denmark, a monarch whose erratic behavior and reformist zeal teetered on the edge of tyranny, and whose mental state was as volatile as the shifting alliances of the era. This union, like so many others, was a cousin marriage, a strategic maneuver intended to bring stability and prestige, yet it plunged Isabella into a life of hardship and exile. For when Christian was overthrown and imprisoned, she followed him into banishment with a loyalty that speaks either of true love or of a hereditary stubbornness that refused to yield to misfortune. Her life in the Danish court and subsequent exile was a grim testament to the precarious nature of royal women, who were expected to be the anchors of dynasties even as the ships of state were steered into the rocks by their husbands, and she died young at just 24. Her health broken by the stress of politics and the rigors of childbirth, leaving behind children who would, in turn, be fed back into the machinery of dynastic marriage. Then there is the story of Eleanor of Austria, born in 1498, another child of Philip and Juana, sandwiched between the fading light of the medieval world and the blazing dawn of the Renaissance. A woman whose life was a series of diplomatic transactions. Originally promised to Henry VII of England, a match that fate mercifully intervened to prevent, she was instead wed to Manuel I of Portugal. A man who was not only much older than her, but also her first cousin once removed, a marriage that effectively kept her within the terrifyingly narrow confines of the family circle. After Manuel's death, she was not allowed the peace of widowhood, but was moved like a chess piece to France to marry Francis I. A man who had been her brother's prisoner and who viewed Eleanor not as a wife to be cherished, but as a living symbol of his humiliation and a treaty he was forced to sign. Her life in the French court was one of cold isolation, ignored by a husband who preferred his mistresses, yet Eleanor bore this indignity with the stoic composure of a true Habsburg. Spending her days in prayer and reading, a silent witness to the vanity of kings, eventually outliving both husbands and retiring into the shadows of history. A woman who fulfilled her duty to marry and breed, but was denied the simple human joys of affection and stability. We must also speak of Catherine of Aragon, born in 1485, the youngest daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. A princess who carried the weight of an alliance between Spain and England on her small shoulders, betrothed at the age of 3 to Arthur, Prince of Wales. A union of second cousins that was intended to cement a geopolitical bond, but instead set the stage for one of the greatest religious upheavals in history. When Arthur died mere months after their wedding, Catherine was left in a cruel limbo, a widow in a foreign land, her dowry unpaid, her future uncertain. A pawn held in reserve until she could be married to Arthur's younger brother, Henry VII. Their early years were marked by genuine affection and effective co-rule, for Catherine was a woman of immense capability, piety, and intellect, yet the biological curse of her lineage, combined perhaps with the inscrutable will of God, denied her the one thing Henry desperately craved, a living son. Her history is written in the litany of miscarriages and stillbirths, a heartbreaking sequence that turned Henry's love into resentment and led to the annulment that would sunder England from Rome, leaving Catherine to die in isolation, steadfastly clinging to her title and her faith. A victim not just of a capricious king, but of a dynastic system that reduced the value of a woman to her reproductive success. These stories, my friends, are not merely anecdotes of the past. They are warnings written in blood, reminding us that when we elevate power above nature and politics above humanity, the result is a slow, agonizing decay that consumes even the mightiest of empires. This concludes the first part of our narrative, covering the initial tragedies of the Habsburg and Trastamara women. I shall pause here and await your instruction to proceed to the next chapter of this history. Let us now turn our eyes to the figure of Margaret of Austria, born in the year 1480, a woman whose life story reads like a parable of resilience amidst the capricious tides of fortune. For she was the only daughter of Emperor Maximilian I and Mary of Burgundy. A child born into the purple, but destined to be treated as a piece of high-value diplomatic luggage from the moment she could walk. Her existence was defined early on by the callous nature of royal betrothals, for at the tender age of 3, she was engaged to Charles VII of France, sent away from her home to be raised in the French court, only to be unceremoniously returned years later like an unwanted gift when Charles decided that the political geography of Anne of Brittany suited his ambitions better than the Habsburg alliance. A humiliation that Margaret, with a precocious dignity that would define her later life, reportedly vowed to avenge. Fate was no kinder in her second match, for she was wed to Juan, the Prince of Asturias and the only son of Ferdinand and Isabella. A union of cousins designed to lock Spain and Austria into an eternal embrace, yet death, the ever-present specter in these narratives, claimed Juan shortly after the wedding, leaving Margaret a widow before she had barely left her teenage years, twice rejected by the cruel mechanics of dynasty, once by the will of a king and once by the will of God. It is a testament to her extraordinary character that she refused to be broken by these tragedies, declining a proposal from Henry VII of England to instead dedicate herself to the governance of the Netherlands, where she ruled not as a mere figurehead, but as a statesman of the highest order, navigating the treacherous currents of European politics with a wisdom that put many of her male contemporaries to shame, fostering the arts, negotiating treaties, and raising her nephew, the future Emperor Charles V, imparting upon him the lessons of rulership that she had learned through the hard school of loss, proving that while the Habsburg blood might be tainted, the Habsburg spirit could occasionally produce a diamond of immense brilliance. We must also look back to an earlier era to see that this tangled web of kinship was not an invention of the Renaissance, but a long-standing tradition of the medieval elite, as exemplified by Blanche of Castile, born in 1188, the granddaughter of the legendary Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II of England. Blanche was a woman in whom the blood of kings flowed with a potency that matched her formidable will, selected by her grandmother to marry Louis VII of France, her cousin, in a union that was intended to heal the rifts between England and France. Unlike the tragic figures who would follow centuries later, Blanche was a force of nature, a white queen who did not merely sit by her husband's side but ruled as a true partner, and upon his death, she assumed the regency for her son, the future Saint Louis IX, governing France with an iron hand wrapped in a velvet glove, crushing rebellions, organizing crusades, and staring down the haughty French barons who resented being ruled by a foreign woman, proving that sometimes the concentration of royal blood produces not frailty, but a terrifying strength. Yet the pendulum swings back to the tragic absurdity of the Habsburgs with Anne of Bohemia and Hungary, born in 1503, a woman whose marriage to her husband, Ferdinand I, was a masterpiece of genetic redundancy, for they were double first cousins, sharing all four grandparents, a biological mirror image that in any sensible world would be cause for alarm, but in the Habsburg worldview was seen as the ultimate consolidation of claims. Anne's life was consumed by the biological imperative of her station, for she bore 15 children, a staggering physical toll that reduced her existence to a perpetual cycle of pregnancy and childbirth, serving as the vessel through which the Habsburgs populated the thrones of Europe. Her body the very mortar that held the empire together, until she collapsed under the strain, dying young and exhausted. A martyr to the dynastic ambition that viewed women as factories for heirs rather than souls to be cherished. In stark contrast to the pious suffering of Anne stands the chaotic and violent life of Joanna I of Naples, born in 1326. A queen who navigated a world where the family tree was less a structure of stability and more a nest of vipers. Joanna married her cousin Andrew of Hungary, a union loathed by her subjects and seemingly by Joanna herself, ending in the brutal murder of Andrew, a crime for which she was widely suspected of complicity, leading her into a spiraling existence of subsequent marriages to other cousins, wars, excommunications, and political intrigues that painted a picture of a woman desperately trying to survive in a male-dominated world that sought to devour her. Her life was a storm of passion and blood, ending as violently as it had been lived, when she was smothered to death by yet another relative, a grim reminder that in the high-stakes Game of Thrones, kinship is no guarantee of safety. Indeed, it is often the relative who holds the dagger. Let us find a moment of respite in the story of Isabella Clara Eugenia, born in 1566, the beloved daughter of Philip II of Spain, a woman who shines as a beacon of competence and grace amidst the gloom of her family's history. Though she was married to her cousin, Archduke Albert of Austria, their partnership in governing the Spanish Netherlands was one of mutual respect and genuine effectiveness. a rare power couple who managed to bring a measure of stability to a region torn apart by religious war, and after Albert's death. Isabella did not retreat into madness or obscurity, but took the vows of a Franciscan tertiary, ruling as a nun governor who combined religious devotion with astute political management, proving that a woman could serve both God and Caesar with equal fidelity. We must also remember Mary of Burgundy, born in 1457, the heiress whose tragic fall from a horse at the age of 25 changed the map of Europe forever. For her marriage to Maximilian, I brought the vast Burgundian inheritance into the Habsburg fold, setting the stage for the empire that would eventually encircle the globe. Her death was a sudden, brutal interruption to a life that held immense promise, a reminder of the fragility of human plans in the face of divine providence, leaving her young children to be raised in a world that would use them as pawns in the endless game of expansion. Fast forwarding to the twilight of this era, we encounter Maria Theresa of Austria, born in 1717, a figure of monumental historical weight. The only woman to rule the Habsburg dominions in her own right, a monarch who defied the Salic law and the armies of Prussia to hold her empire together. Maria Theresa was a paradox, an enlightened despot who modernized her military, reformed education, and centralized the bureaucracy, all while being pregnant essentially for 2 decades. Bearing 16 children whom she loved fiercely, but whom she also sacrificed on the altar of diplomacy, marrying them off to various Bourbons and Habsburgs in a desperate attempt to secure peace through blood, unaware that she was weaving the final, suffocating strands of the genetic web that would doom her descendants. There is also the formidable Yolande of Aragon, born in 1384, a woman who operated in the shadows of the 100 Years' War. A master strategist who recognized the potential of a peasant girl named Joan of Arc and provided the support necessary for the Maid of Orleans to save France, demonstrating that true power often resides not on the throne but behind it, in the sharp mind of a woman who understands that dynastic survival requires more than just breeding, it requires vision. We recall Margaret of York, the sister of Richard III and Edward IV, who married Charles the Bold of Burgundy, a woman who brought the elegance and intrigue of the Wars of the Roses to the continent, becoming a patron of the arts and a savvy political operator who tried, largely in vain, to temper her husband's reckless ambition. And finally, we must acknowledge Catherine de' Medici, born in 1519, an Italian outsider in the French court who, though not inbred herself, adopted the royal addiction to consanguineous marriage for her children with a disastrous zeal. Catherine's life is a dark epic of survival, a woman labeled the Black Queen, blamed for the wars of religion and the horrors of the Cent Bartholomew's Day massacre, yet when we look closer, we see a mother fighting like a cornered tigress to keep the Valois dynasty alive as her sons died one by one. Succumbing to tuberculosis and madness, a tragic figure who ruled over a crumbling kingdom, using poison and policy in equal measure because she believed it was the only way to preserve her family's legacy in a world that hated her. These women, from the pious to the ruthless, from the tragic to the triumphant, were the vertebrae of medieval and early modern history, their lives a testament to the unbearable weight of the crown. And as we recount their stories, we must look beyond the dry dates and treaties to see the human cost of a system that tried to turn biology into a tool of the state, a hubris for which they paid the ultimate price. This concludes the narrative of the royal women. I await your direction to delve into the next segment of the transcript concerning the ancient dream temples and the spiritual history of sleep. Having contemplated the heavy, earthly chains of dynastic bloodlines, let us now shift our gaze from the palaces of kings to the quiet, shadowed chambers of the ancient soul. For if history is the record of our waking deeds, then theology and anthropology are surely the maps of our sleeping spirits. And it is in the universal vulnerability of sleep that we find humanity's most profound attempt to touch the divine. In the classical world of ancient Greece, sleep was never merely a biological pause or a cessation of labor, but rather a sacred act, a theurgy or God working. Where the boundary between the mortal and the immortal became permeable, most vividly realized in the Asclepiad, the great healing temples dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine. Imagine, if you will, the pilgrim arriving at Epidaurus not as a patient checking into a clinic, but as a supplicant entering a holy mystery, undergoing a rigorous purification that involved fasting, ritual bathing in sacred springs, and the offering of sacrifices to strip away the psychic grime of the mundane world before they could attempt incubation, the sacred slumber. Within the abaton, the dark, hallowed dormitory of the temple, the sick would lie upon the skins of sacrificed animals, surrounded by the flickering light of oil lamps and the hushed prayers of priests, drifting into a state of consciousness that was neither fully awake nor asleep, waiting for the god to appear in a dream to offer a cure or a surgery performed by divine hands. It is a testament to the profound faith of these people that they welcomed the presence of non-venomous snakes, the earthly avatars of Asclepius, which were allowed to slither freely among the sleeping bodies, their cold touch in the dark interpreted not as a nightmare but as a kiss of grace, a sign that the god was moving among them to heal the broken. This practice reveals a fundamental theological truth of the ancient mind, that healing was not a mechanics of the body alone, but a realignment of the soul with the divine order, achieved only when the rational mind surrendered to the chaotic, revelatory power of the dream. Travel with me now across the Mediterranean to the sun-scorched sands of ancient Egypt, where the theological conception of sleep was even more perilous, viewed as a little death where the soul, or Ba, detached from the physical vessel to wander the treacherous pathways of the Jewet, the underworld. The Egyptian night was thick with invisible threats, and thus the act of going to bed was a ritual of spiritual fortification, a defensive operation against the chaotic forces that sought to sever the tether between body and soul. The air of the bedchamber would be thick with the smoke of frankincense and myrrh. Resins burned not for their pleasant scent, but for their power to exorcise malevolent spirits and elevate the sleeper's prayers to the heavens, while the sleeper themselves might recite spells invoking Thoth, the Lord of Wisdom, or rely on the grotesque but benevolent protection of Bes, the dwarf god whose lion-maned visage was carved onto headboards to scare away the nightmares that lurked in the shadows. We see here a profound anxiety about the vulnerability of the unconscious state, leading the Egyptians to turn their beds into altars, complete with headdresses designed to align the head with the eternal stars, ensuring that even in the oblivion of sleep, the individual remained oriented within the cosmic machinery of the universe. Further east, in the ziggurat-shadowed cities of Babylon, the line between the dream and the decree of history was non-existent. For the Babylonians viewed the dream world as a battleground of omens where the gods Marduk or Ishtar might whisper the fate of empires, or where demons might sow deception. The Shilu or dream priests were the bureaucrats of this nocturnal realm, trained to decipher the cryptic symbolism of the night using massive compendiums of dream omens that categorized every conceivable vision, from a lion representing victory to a drowning man signifying betrayal. The Babylonian sleeper did not merely close their eyes. They prepared for a potential divine encounter by placing protective tablets under their beds and tracing magic circles around their sleeping quarters, engaging in dream incubation not just for healing, but for decision-making, sleeping in temples to ask the gods whether they should wage war or plant crops, essentially outsourcing their free will to the arbitration of the subconscious. In the spiritual landscape of Vedic India, this connection to the cosmos was internalized, transformed from a dialogue with external gods into a realization of the internal divinity. Where sleep was described in the Upanishads as a return of the Atman, the individual soul, to the Brahman, the universal reality, a nightly reunion with the infinite. The preparation for this journey involved pranayama, the discipline of breath control, not merely to relax the body, but to harmonize the individual's life force with the rhythmic pulse of the universe. Ensuring that the soul's travel during deep sleep was peaceful and free from the karmic turbulence that caused nightmares. The layout of the sleeping space was dictated by a sacred geometry, with heads never pointing north towards the realm of death, and the body anointed with oils like sesame in the practice of abhyanga, transforming the act of rest into a ritual of purification that honored the body as the temple of the spirit. Similarly, in the Taoist traditions of ancient China, sleep was an exercise in energetic hygiene, a time to balance the qi and allow the hun, the ethereal soul, to wander the spirit realms while the po, the corporeal soul, guarded the body. The Taoist adept would engage in qigong and meditation to calm the shen spirit residing in the heart. For a disturbed heart meant a chaotic spirit that could easily be lost or attacked during the night. The bedroom was a carefully curated vessel for energy, with beds aligned according to geomantic principles that predated feng shui, and talismans of cinnabar placed beneath pillows to anchor the wandering soul, proving that for the ancients, the maintenance of health was inseparable from the maintenance of spiritual integrity. Across the ocean, in the vast landscapes of the indigenous Americas, the dream was the primary language of the Great Mystery, a communal resource where the visions of the individual could shape the destiny of the tribe. The vision quest of the Lakota and other nations was a rigorous rite of passage involving fasting and isolation in nature, a deliberate inducement of a dream state to receive a name, a purpose, or a spirit guide, while the iconic dreamcatcher of the Ojibwe served as a spiritual filter, a web woven to snare the harmful visions while allowing the good to pass through the center. A beautiful recognition of the need to protect the innocence of the sleeper, especially the child, from the unseen complexities of the spirit world. Returning to the cradle of civilization in Mesopotamia, we find the goddess Nanch, the lady of prophecy and social justice, presiding over the chaotic waters of the dream, where worshippers would bathe in sacred rivers and anoint themselves with oil to wash away the impurities of the waking world before entering the temple precincts to sleep. Here, the fear of the night hag Lilith or the demoness Lamishtu was palpable, leading to the widespread use of amulets depicting the demon Pazuzu, a fierce entity invoked to fight fire with fire, protecting the vulnerable sleeper from the predation of spirits who sought to do harm in the darkness. In the misty groves of the Celtic lands, the Druids understood sleep as a journey to the otherworld, a realm of fairies and ancestors that lay just behind the veil of waking reality, accessible through rituals involving sacred herbs like mugwort and vervain, which were burned or brewed to thin the barrier between the worlds. The Celt did not sleep to escape reality but to deepen it, seeking prophetic dreams by sleeping on thin places like fairy mounds or ancient barrows, trusting that the wisdom of the dead would bleed into the mind of the living. And finally, in the intricate spiritual ecosystem of ancient Japan, the masters of Onmyodo, the way of yin and yang, navigated the treacherous hour of the ox when the veil was thinnest, using Ofuda paper talismans and the burning of sandalwood incense to create a spiritual perimeter around the sleeper. They understood that the night was the domain of the yakai, and that a dream could be a premonition of illness or a visitation by a spirit, requiring a vigilance that turned the bedroom into a fortress of symbols and prayers. In all these diverse cultures, separated by time and geography, we find a singular unifying truth, that for our ancestors, sleep was not a biological triviality but a spiritual frontier, a time when the ego dissolved and the soul stood naked before the cosmos, requiring ritual, protection, and profound respect. This concludes our exploration of the sacred history of sleep. I stand ready to proceed to the next chapter of our journey, which will take us from the ethereal realms of the dream to the tangible, waterlogged ruins of the sunken city of Heracleion. We move now from the ethereal landscape of dreams, where the soul wanders in the safety of the night, to the tangible, melancholy landscape of memory and stone, where the greatest works of human hands are subject to the relentless, eroding patience of the earth and sea. As a historian, I am often struck by the fragility of civilization. How cities that once believed themselves to be the center of the universe can be erased so completely that they become mere whispers of myth, dismissed by later scholars as fables until the earth chooses to reveal its secrets. Nowhere is this truth more hauntingly illustrated than in the story of Heracleion, a city that served as the grand gateway to Egypt long before Alexandria rose to eclipse it. A bustling metropolis of commerce and theology situated at the mouth of the Nile, where the Mediterranean kissed the sacred river. For centuries, this city was the Venice of Egypt, a labyrinth of canals, quays, and monumental temples where Greek merchants and Egyptian priests mingled in a cosmopolitan dance of trade and worship. Yet for over a millennium, it vanished from the map, swallowed by the sea, leaving behind only cryptic references in the texts of Herodotus and Strabo, leading many to believe it was no more real than Atlantis. It was not until the turn of the millennium, in the year 2000, that the underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudio, guided by the intuition that history is rarely wrong about geography, pierced the veil of the silt-laden waters of Abu Qir Bay and brought the city back from the dead. The discovery was a theological shock as much as an archaeological one, for what lay beneath the waves was not merely a collection of ruins, but a frozen moment of catastrophe and devotion. A city that had been preserved by the very mud that consumed it. Consider the Temple of Amun-Jareb, the spiritual heart of the city, a massive sanctuary where the pharaohs of Egypt would travel to receive the divine investiture that legitimized their rule. A place where the earthly power of the king was nodded to the eternal power of the gods. To see the colossal statues of Hapi, the god of the Nile's abundance, standing over 5 meters tall and gazing blindly through the murky water, is to confront the transient nature of all human glory. For these idols, once anointed with oil and incense, now host only the silent procession of fish and the slow accumulation of sediment. The destruction of Heracleion was not the result of a single furious day of war, but a slow, agonizing betrayal by the earth itself, a process known as soil liquefaction, where the waterlogged clay beneath the city, destabilized by earthquakes and the weight of the monumental stone, simply lost its solidity, turning into a slurry that sucked the temples, the houses, and the dreams of its inhabitants down into the depths. It is a sobering reminder that the ground we stand upon is not as permanent as our theology might hope, and that nature, in its quiet, geological violence, holds the final veto over the longevity of our monuments. Yet the resurrection of Heracleion offers a profound gift to the historian, for the anaerobic mud preserved artifacts with a clarity that the air destroys, yielding gold coins, intricate jewelry, ritual vessels, and over 70 ancient shipwrecks that tell the story of a city that was alive with the noise of humanity, the shouting of dockworkers, the chanting of priests, and the haggling of merchants in languages that span the known world. The discovery of the decree of Nectanebo I, a black granite stele perfectly preserved, confirmed the city's dual identity as Thonis to the Egyptians and Heracleion to the Greeks, solving a riddle that had plagued scholars for centuries and proving that this submerged ruin was indeed the customs checkpoint of the ancient world, the eye of the needle through which all wealth entered Egypt. But let us descend from the macrocosm of sunken cities to the microcosm of the human body, for history is not only written in the collapse of empires but in the intimate, throbbing reality of physical pain, specifically the agony of the tooth, a suffering so primal that it has driven human innovation for thousands of years. We often assume that the ancients were helpless in the face of medical crisis, resigning themselves to prayer and suffering. Yet the archaeological record reveals a stunning narrative of resilience and ingenuity in the field of dentistry, proving that the drive to heal is as old as the sensation of pain itself. Travel back with me nearly 9,000 years to the Neolithic settlement of Mayagar in present-day Pakistan, where we find the earliest evidence of dentistry not as a crude hacking but as a precise craft. Here, flint tips were used to drill into the enamel of living molars, a procedure performed without the mercy of modern anesthesia, likely using a bow drill mechanism similar to that used for making fire, a testament to the sheer endurance of our ancestors who would tolerate the acute, vibrating agony of the drill to escape the chronic, throbbing decay of the tooth. These early healers even used bitumen, a tar-like substance, to seal the cavities, creating the world's first dental fillings and proving that the concept of restorative medicine predates the pyramids by millennia. In the land of the pharaohs, the approach to the mouth was a synthesis of the practical and the magical, embodied by Hesira, the first named dentist in history, who served under Pharaoh Djoser around 2600 BCE. The Egyptians, whose bread was often filled with the abrasive sand of the desert, suffered terribly from worn teeth and abscesses, leading them to develop a pharmacopoeia of remedies recorded in the Ebers Papyrus. Mixing biology with theology by applying poultices of honey and herbs while reciting incantations to banish the worm they believed caused tooth decay. They understood that the health of the mouth was the health of the vessel, attempting crude surgeries to drain abscesses and even using gold wire to bind loose teeth together, a practice that highlights their obsession with maintaining the integrity of the body for the afterlife. For how could one speak the words of power in the hall of judgment if one's jaw was broken? Across the sea, the Etruscans of pre-Roman Italy elevated dentistry from a medical necessity to an art form of vanity and status, crafting dental bridges of exquisite gold workmanship that held human or animal teeth in place of missing ones, creating a smile that was both a functioning tool and a display of wealth. This concern for aesthetics was inherited by the Romans, whose approach was characteristically pragmatic and occasionally grotesque. While Celsus wrote with clinical precision about the extraction of teeth and the use of forceps, the Roman elite were known to use urine, rich in ammonia, as a whitening mouthwash, a practice that revolts the modern sensibility but demonstrates the lengths to which humanity will go for the sake of beauty and social standing. Meanwhile, in the rainforests of Mesoamerica, the Maya viewed the mouth as a sacred stage for spiritual expression, performing dental modifications that had nothing to do with decay and everything to do with divinity. They drilled perfectly round holes into their incisors to inlay jade, turquoise, and hematite, not for repair, but to honor the gods of rain and maize, transforming their smiles into jeweled offerings that signaled their elite status and their connection to the cosmic forces, using drill techniques so precise that they avoided the nerve, a feat of anatomical knowledge that rivals modern practice. In the East, the medical traditions of China and India integrated the teeth into a holistic vision of the universe, where a toothache was not an isolated event, but a symptom of a disruption in the flow of qi or an imbalance of the doshas. The Chinese used acupuncture to treat dental pain by manipulating the energy meridians that connected the jaw to the kidneys and stomach, while the Ayurvedic practitioners of India pioneered the use of chewing sticks from the neem tree and the practice of oil pulling to purify the mouth, understanding thousands of years ago that oral health was the gateway to systemic health. Thus, whether through the flint drill of the Neolithic farmer, the gold wire of the Etruscan noble, or the jade inlay of the Mayan king, we see a universal human story, a refusal to accept pain as the final word, and a relentless creative struggle to preserve the body, which is, after all, the only temple we truly inhabit. This concludes the current exploration of these lost worlds and ancient arts, I await your command to proceed to the final reflections or further narratives. You are absolutely right. To summarize the profound intellectual shift of the Hellenistic world, or to rush the conclusion of this vast human odyssey, would be a disservice to the complexity of the history we are unraveling. Let us not hasten to the end, but rather step deliberately into the sun-drenched courtyards of the Lyceum and the stark, medicinal chambers of the Hippocratic physicians, where the history of dentistry undergoes its most radical transformation, the divorce of the tooth from the spirit realm and its marriage to the realm of reason. In the ancient Greek world, a civilization that prided itself on the relentless interrogation of nature, the practice of dentistry began to shed the heavy robes of superstition. While the masses still flocked to the dream temples of Asclepius hoping for a divine visitation, a new breed of thinker was emerging, men like Hippocrates and Aristotle, who dared to suggest that a throbbing molar was not a punishment from the gods or a demonic possession, but a biological malfunction, a puzzle to be solved through observation, logic, and the cold steel of the surgical instrument. This was the dawn of rational medicine, and it fundamentally altered how humanity approached the sanctity of the mouth. Hippocrates, whose name has become synonymous with the medical profession, cast a scrutinizing eye upon the oral cavity, producing texts that treated teeth not as mystical ivory markers of destiny, but as anatomical structures subject to the same laws of decay and growth as bone and flesh. In the Hippocratic corpus, we find detailed treatises on the eruption patterns of teeth, the genesis of decay, and the treatment of gum disease, all grounded in the prevailing medical theory of the four humors. To the Greek physician, a toothache was often interpreted as an accumulation of bad humors, perhaps an excess of phlegm or sharp, acrid bile descending from the head into the roots of the teeth. The cure, therefore, was not a prayer to a sky deity, but a rebalancing of the body's internal fluids through bleeding, purging, or the application of drawing poultices. Consider the dietary wisdom of the time, which possessed a prescience that modern science has only recently reconfirmed. The Greeks, observing the ravages of decay, correctly identified that soft, sweet, and sticky foods were the enemies of the smile. In response, physicians prescribed a dental diet rich in coarse grains, crisp apples, and fibrous vegetables. Understanding that the mechanical action of chewing these foods acted as a natural scouring agent, keeping the enamel free of the rot-inducing films we now call plaque. Furthermore, the Greeks were the fragrant pioneers of breath control, utilizing mastic gum, the crystallized resin of the mastic tree found on the island of Chios, as a proto-chewing gum. This was not merely a confection, but a medicinal tool. The resin possessed natural antibacterial properties that soothed inflamed gums and freshened the breath, a practice that became so culturally ingrained that the mastic smile became a symbol of hygiene and refinement in the classical world. However, when prevention failed and the rot set in, the Greek approach turned from dietary gentle persuasion to the brutal necessity of surgery. The Greeks possessed a terrifying array of medical instrumentation, including the odontagra, a specialized pair of iron forceps designed solely for the extraction of teeth. We must pause to appreciate the sheer visceral horror of this procedure in an age before Novocaine. The patient, seated perhaps on a low stool in the physician's light-filled room, would have to endure the clamping of cold iron upon a raw, inflamed nerve. The pain management for such an ordeal was a dark alchemy of its own. Draughts of strong wine to dull the senses, or more potent, dangerous concoctions of opium poppy, henbane, and mandrake root, substances that walked the fine line between sedation and death. For abscesses, the treatment was equally grim. Physicians would use heated lancets to pierce the gum and drain the infection, or apply cautery tools, red-hot wires, to burn out the decay and kill the nerve, a practice that required a steady hand from the doctor and an iron will from the patient. Aristotle, the great classifier of the natural world, also turned his formidable intellect toward the mouth. He studied the comparative anatomy of jaws, noting the differences between the teeth of lions, dogs, and men, attempting to place humanity within the broader animal kingdom. It is true that he famously stumbled, asserting in his History of Animals that men possessed more teeth than women, a bizarre error likely born of a small sample size or the patriarchal assumptions of his era, but even his mistakes reveal crucial shift. He was counting, measuring, and categorizing. He was stripping the mouth of its magic and trying to understand it as a machine. He observed the phenomenon of wisdom teeth appearing late in life and documented cases of congenital toothlessness, treating these not as omens but as biological variations. In the Greek mind, the body was a microcosm of the universe, understandable through logic, and dentistry was simply the mechanics of maintaining one small but vital part of that whole. And so, as we look back across the sweep of millennia, from the flint-wielding shamans of Pakistan to the philosopher-surgeons of Athens, a grand and singular narrative emerges. It is a story not just of teeth, but of the relentless human refusal to suffer in silence. The history of dentistry is, at its core, the history of our species' battle against entropy. Think of the Etruscan noblewoman checking her reflection in a polished bronze mirror, smiling to reveal a bridge of gold and ivory, an act of defiance against age and decay. Think of the Mayan lord enduring the drill to implant a piece of jade into his tooth, transforming his mouth into a statement of cosmic power. Think of the Egyptian priest mixing honey and ochre to soothe a pharaoh's throbbing jaw so that the chants of the morning ritual could continue uninterrupted. These disparate threads, the spiritual, the cosmetic, the surgical, and the magical, weave together into a single tapestry of ingenuity. We often look back at the past with a sense of pity for their primitive tools, shuddering at the thought of a bow drill or a urine mouthwash, but we should instead look with awe. Without the benefit of germ theory, X-rays, or antibiotics, our ancestors used every resource at their disposal: the stones of the earth, the plants of the field, the metals of the forge, and the gods of the sky to solve the universal problem of pain. The obsidian blades of the Maya and the iron forceps of the Greeks are the ancestors of the laser and the scalpel. The herbal poultices of the Ayurveda are the forefathers of our modern pharmaceuticals. The gold wires of the Etruscans are the direct lineage of the dental implant. The tools found in the dusty strata of archaeological digs, the copper probes, the beeswax fillings, the scrolls of herbal remedies, are not just debris. They are monuments to human empathy and invention. They tell us that even in the deepest past, when a person cried out in pain, there was someone else, a priest, a barber, a smith, or a physician who stepped forward with a tool in hand and tried to help. That impulse, that drive to heal and to restore, is the true legacy of this history. We are the inheritors of a 10,000-year-old struggle to keep the body whole, a struggle that connects the high-tech dental clinics of today with the smoky, incense-filled rooms of the ancient world. In the end, the story of the tooth is the story of us, vulnerable, vain, fragile, and endlessly, brilliantly creative in our quest to survive the bite of time. As we draw the threads of this vast historical tapestry together, it becomes necessary to pause and reflect not merely on the specific techniques of the ancient surgeon or the specific genetic tragedies of the Habsburg line, but on the profound, underlying unity of the human experience that these seemingly disparate stories reveal. It is here, in the quiet contemplation of the theologian and the rigorous analysis of the historian, that we begin to see the true face of our ancestors. They were not distant, alien figures inhabiting a world of incomprehensible superstition. Rather, they were men and women locked in the same eternal struggle that defines our own existence. The struggle against the inevitable decay of the flesh, and the desperate, beautiful desire to impose order, meaning, and continuity upon a chaotic universe. Consider, for a moment, the striking parallel between the royal chambers of Madrid and the dental clinics of ancient Etruria. In the palaces of Spain, we witness the tragic undoing of the human form through the hubris of inbreeding, where the desire to preserve a dynasty resulted in the collapse of the very biological vessel it sought to protect, the Habsburg jaw becoming a monstrous monument to political vanity. Yet at the same time, in the workshops of the Etruscans, we see the exact opposite impulse, the use of gold, ivory, and artifice to repair the failings of the body, to construct a bridge over the gap left by decay, and to restore dignity to the human face. Is this not the central paradox of our history? On one hand, we are capable of destroying ourselves through our obsession with power and purity. On the other, we possess a relentless, almost divine creativity that drives us to heal, to mend, and to beautify the broken places. The gold wire binding the teeth of a Roman senator and the genetic knot binding the lineage of Charles II are both manifestations of the human refusal to accept the natural limits of our existence. One leads to destruction, the other to preservation, but both stem from the same root: the refusal to vanish, the refusal to crumble, the refusal to let nature have the final word. Let us also look deeper into the connection between the little death of sleep and the great death of civilizations. We spoke of the dream temples of Asclepius and the sleep rituals of the Egyptians, where the night was a realm of spiritual activity, a place where the soul sought guidance, healing, and contact with the divine. The ancients understood that to sleep was to surrender control, to drift into a world where the rigid boundaries of the ego dissolved. Now, cast your mind to the sunken city of Heracleion. For 1,000 years, that great metropolis slept beneath the silt of Abukir Bay, its temples silent, its statues of happy gazing blindly into the murk, its gold coins resting in the mud. Was this not a form of incubation on a civilizational scale? Just as the pilgrim and the Abatin waited in the darkness for a revelation from the god, so too did the city of Thonis Heracleion wait in the darkness of the sea for the revelation of rediscovery. The archaeologist Frank Gaudio in this light acts as the priest who awakens the sleeper, interpreting the dreams of the city, its steels, its shards, its shipwrecks, and bringing its message back to the land of the living. This continuity reminds us that nothing in history is ever truly lost. It merely waits, suspended in the amber of time, for the right moment to re-emerge. The anxieties that drove the Babylonian to recite incantations against the night hag are the same anxieties that drive us to preserve our history in museums and archives: the fear of oblivion, and the hope that something of us, a dream, a tooth, a statue, a story, will survive the night. Furthermore, we must reconsider the spiritual dimension of the pain we have discussed. The history of dentistry is often framed as a progression of technology, from stone drills to lasers, but from a theological perspective, it is a history of compassion. When we look at the crude beeswax filling in a Neolithic tooth or the herbal poultice applied by a Chinese physician, we are witnessing a profound moral act. In a world that was often brutal and short, where survival was the primary imperative, the fact that humans took the time and care to alleviate the suffering of another, to drill with precision, to mix analgesic herbs, to craft prosthetic aesthetics, speaks to the inherent sanctity we attribute to the human person. We do not let each other suffer in isolation, we intervene. We use the materials of the earth, the obsidian, the gold, the myrrh, the poppy, to minister to the body, recognizing it as the temple of the Holy Spirit, worthy of maintenance and repair. The excruciating pain of the ancient drill was a price paid for the hope of relief, a testament to the courage of the patient and the dedication of the healer. It is a lineage of care that stretches unbroken for 10,000 years, a silent covenant between the sufferer and the Savior that forms the bedrock of civilization. And what of the fair folk and the spirits that inhabited the dreams of the Celts and the indigenous tribes of the Americas? Do they not tell us that the human mind has always sought to populate the silence of the world with meaning? The dream catcher of the Ojibwe is not merely a craft, It is a theological assertion that the universe is permeable, that we are surrounded by forces that can be filtered, understood, and integrated into our lives. The vision quest is not just a rite of passage. It is a declaration that the individual life has a cosmic purpose, revealed only when we strip away the distractions of the waking world. Even today, in our electrified, insomniac society, we still yearn for this connection. We may call it subconscious processing or lucid dreaming rather than a visitation from the ancestors, but the hunger is the same, the hunger to know that our internal lives matter, that our nightly journeys are not random firings of neurons, but chapters in a deeper story. So as we stand at the end of this long narrative journey, looking back at the inbred queens trapped in their golden cages, the pilgrims sleeping among snakes, the merchants of the sunken city, and the patients enduring the flint drill, we see a single, unified image of humanity. We are fragile, yes, we are prone to decay both in our bodies and in our empires. We make terrible mistakes in our pursuit of power, but we are also magnificent in our resilience. We are the species that cleans its teeth with crushed eggshells to stay beautiful. We are the species that sleeps with iron amulets to ward off demons. We are the species that builds temples on the edge of the sea, knowing they might fall, and then dives into the depths 1,000 years later to find them again. We are the dreamers, the builders, the healers, and the survivors. And as long as we have bodies that feel pain and souls that dream, this history will continue to be written, night after night, century after century, in the endless, beautiful struggle to be human. This, my friends, is the true lesson of the past, that while the jaw may crumble and the city may sink, the spirit that drove the hand to carve the stone and the mind to dream the cure remains imperishable.